Welcome to the Overton Pod, a new podcast by myself and that man over there, Kanthan. How are you, sir?
I am excellent, as always.
Yeah, good. So something new. Any thoughts?
I think the concept of doing something that really looks at the Overton window, so to speak, is going to be a bit of a game changer for people because they don't really think in terms of concepts of how these societal shifts come to play and how conversations move and, more importantly, how the world changes as a direct result of that.
Yeah.
So, I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, maybe to give some background. So about a year ago, I started on a kind of media journey. This is going to sound very esoteric, but I started on this sort of media journey where I decided I wanted to get into the media space a bit more than just being a commentator occasionally on podcasts and other shows and on social media. And the reason behind that obviously was what we went through from 2020 up until 2023. Must I mention it by name?
Yeah. The spicy cough, as a friend of ours would describe it.
Yeah, that's Big Daddy. The COVID insanity, the pandemic, and I really realized that that and so much else. That was a life-changing event for me in many, many ways. There was a lot of realization about how the world works, about who's in control, about how quickly humans will just acquiesce to things, and some really terrible things. There's so many examples, but adult parents forcing masks onto their 18-month children. There was just so much about that period that was truly evil. But what I realized is people have a view of the world which is informed very much by the people around them and then very much by the media and what is in the broad sort of Overton window. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Overton window is coined or named after a gentleman whose surname was Overton, and American guy, economist as far as I recall. And he basically said, look, there's certain topics that fall within the Overton window. They fall within a window of acceptability. And essentially, those are the things you're allowed to talk about. Those are the things which are socially acceptable, which you won't be shunned for talking about, for mentioning. And then there's things that fall outside of the Overton window, which you will be shunned for talking about, which aren't popular, which you'll never hear politicians speak about, for example, because they want votes. And if politicians do talk about it, they'll be called populists, for example, and be given derogatory names. And I just realized that that's kind of the world we live in. And if you want to make a positive impact from my perspective, I feel as if you have to deal with the things that perhaps fall outside of the Overton window. You have to speak about the things or the way of approaching certain topics that people may find uncomfortable, that people have never heard that particular view. And so I launched the Overton Press. It's been slow going, admittedly, but an online publication that at the moment is a Substack and will ultimately expand further than that. But this is an Overton Pod, an Overton podcast with the intent of Kanthan and myself having conversations. We're going to do it every 2 weeks. We're going to release an episode, or we're going to try. And we're going to try to talk about things. And just to give some examples, perhaps, if you look at the abortion debate in the world, but let's take the United States as an example, that has fallen inside and outside of the Overton window in many different ways over time. Very much through the 60s and 70s was America moved towards pro-abortion or pro being able to access that service. And then with the advent of ultrasound and the view of fetuses, babies, depending on how you view it, again, an Overton concept, with that coming in, then it became a bit of a question about, well, where is there life here that we're perhaps ending sooner? And so that's a conversation that's moved in and out of the Overton window. That's a big conversation over time. Another big conversation over time, well, more recent, is the Russia conversation. I would reckon that 4 years ago, if you'd asked most people what they thought about Putin, they were ambivalent. Most people. I think some people would have said, if people were very invested, they would have said, look, they've got a view one way or another, good, bad, whatever it is. But I think most people would have been ambivalent in the world. We're now told that he is Satan incarnate. He is the ultimate evil. That's the current Overton window. And I think that these are the types of conversations.
Depending on which part of the world you're in, Jonathan, because if you look in terms of how the votes have gone around the Ukraine issues, that's very much a Western world outlook, so to speak, in terms of whether or not Putin is Satan incarnate. I must say that up until 4 years ago, to your point, I was probably in the category of people who thought that Putin was Satan incarnate. Well, not Satan incarnate, but certainly, kind of more like a mafia boss. Yeah, I still have a view that he's a mafia boss.
As do I, actually.
But I also think that he's a very smart person, and he also generally, in my view, has the best interests of his populace at heart, which is not something that I had considered 4 years ago.
Okay.
Interesting takes on things.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, you often get a lot of kickback against your comments. When you're on the Burning Platform with Gareth, for example, you'll get a fair amount of kickback to your takes on Russia, as an example.
Well, it's an interesting thing because people assume that because I state things the way I see them, that means that I necessarily support them. So, for example, when I said at the time at which this war started 2 years ago, I said exactly what was going to happen. I predicted the course of events. I did the comparative strength of the forces that were involved. And my take on it was that Russia's going to win this. And everyone said, oh, there he goes, he's pro-Russia. Again, let's go back to October 7th. I took a very studied view on this, and I said that whatever your thoughts may be in terms of who you support, it's very clear to me Israel is going to win this. Now, that doesn't mean that I am supporting things that are happening on the ground. It's making a very studied observation around what the various forces are that come to play. And, contrary to popular opinion, facts are not determined by popular opinion. So, again.
Absolutely. And, facts become a problem. I mean, I'll go back to COVID again. I turned around and said, this is not the virus you're being told it is. And I was called a granny killer, right? I mean, that wasn't factual. But at the end of the day, the Overton at the time became very narrow and this is a deadly virus. You need to stay home, stay safe. If you don't, you're going to kill people and you're a bad person. And the facts of that obviously have come out much too late, and we all made a terrible mistake. And I would think that it's responsibility of any of those of us in honest media, and I exclude pretty much all mainstream media from that, legacy media, corporate media, whatever you want to call it. All of those of us in honest media need to be as honest as we can be about the things that are going on in the world, because it has a direct influence on the way people behave, on the way people react, on the way people think about things. And I mean, what do you think about what's going on in the US? I feel as if, I'm talking about the presidential election, I feel as if there's been a shift. So 2015, there was this, Trump's Hitler, Orange Hitler. He's going to do all these terrible things. He was going to put the gays in camps, I think it was. These were not fringe theories either. This was New York Times. This was Washington Post. This was mainstream, Huffington Post when it still existed. He was going to do these terrible. He was going to deport all the immigrants, and very viciously as well. It was going to be terrible. He was going to collapse the United States in some way. The economy was going to be terrible. But that's Paul Krugman.
But interesting choice of words. You say immigrants. I say invaders.
Yes, I'm fine with the word illegal immigrants, but
Sure. If we qualify it as illegal,
the term invasion has become certainly more popular in the last year. But here's what I want to get to is the Overton window was that certainly from a corporate media perspective, and in South Africa, I know Ramon and I, for example, discussed Trump in a not necessarily negative light. So there were certain things we weren't happy about, but certain things we were like, well, he might in some ways be good. And we predicted that he would in fact win. I think you did as well.
I did as well, yes.
Yeah. So, the thing is we've now had 4 years of the guy, and we had 4 years without the guy. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, this is terrible. We got Biden and Trump. It's a redo of 2020. It's two 80-year-old men, and it's the end of the world. For me, it's the best possible democratic choice you could have. You have Donald Trump, who ruled for 4 years, and it's very obvious what kind of leader he was. It's very obvious what kind of effects he had. Certainly, if you're an American, you would be feeling that. But Biden has then also had 4 years, and it's very obvious what type of leader he is. Well, he's almost had 4 years, 3 years and a few months. And it's very obvious what type of leader he is. And people now get to choose. They get a choice you almost never get, which is you get to choose between two people you know exactly how they will be as the President of the United States. But the Overton window shift is that I feel like the Trump is Hitler stuff isn't selling anymore. That Overton window seems to have completely shifted.
Quite right. And in fact, what we've seen happening, particularly with the slew of court cases that have been going on, is that every time Trump gets taken out by the courts, his popularity spikes.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite phenomenal. Well, the ruling the other day was quite interesting. You saw that?
I did indeed.
Yeah, ridiculous. You want to give like a bit of a précis on that?
Well, effectively, you had a scenario where Trump borrowed money from banks.
Like you would if you got a bond on a house.
Correct. And he used Mar-a-Lago, which is his golf estate in Florida, as collateral for the loan. And the banks took a look at it, and they were very happy to approve it. And they went ahead and gave him the loan, and the loan was paid back in its entirety with interest.
With interest.
With interest, yes.
The one thing I just wanted to add was not only did the banks give him the loan, but he said, look, Mar-a-Lago is worth a certain amount. I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head.
It was about 118 million.
Okay, he said it's worth about 118 million. And the banks, of course, never give you a loan without checking if your collateral is in fact worth
Absolutely true.
So they then did their due diligence, as all banks have to do. It's actually part of their regulations. They did their due diligence and said, yeah, we agree, Mar-a-Lago is probably worth about that. And so we will give you the loan against that as the collateral. And subsequently, the New York court has found that because...
Well, let's be very clear. What the New York court did was they went back and they did their valuation of Mar-a-Lago. They decided that Mar-a-Lago is worth 18 million.
Yeah, which is hilarious. If you don't know what Mar-a-Lago is, it's beachfront property in Miami.
Yes.
It's beachfront property it's like a few acres of beachfront property in Miami, with a house, not a house, an estate built onto that, which looks pretty much like a palace. And the fittings inside, obviously, we all know Donald Trump. Are pretty expensive fittings, marble floors and gold taps.
But essentially what they've charged him with is they've said that he overstated the value of his property to fraudulently obtain a loan, which the banks denied. The banks say they did their due diligence. They were very happy with it. But the courts have insisted, no, actually he's lied he's committed fraud because he overstated the value of his property. Yeah. And this is a criminal offense. Now, understand there's no victim here.
No, there is no victim.
The banks were certainly not put out as a result. The banks were very happy to get their money back. And in fact, the banks testified in the New York court on behalf of Trump, saying that they were very happy with the deal. So this is clearly a political hatchet job in terms of Trump. But the knock-on effects, again, to your point, are kind of interesting. Because now you have businesses who are saying that they are pulling out of New York and they are going to relocate their businesses, their incorporation, into other states. And Florida and Texas are now coming up at the top of the list.
Yeah, well, they went after Elon Musk as well.
Well, that was the Delaware courts.
Yes.
So again, the Elon Musk case is a very interesting story because at the beginning, when Elon was working out his compensation as chief executive of Tesla, he basically said that if he's able to double the value of the stock, that he will get paid something like I think it was
45 billion or something like that.
Close to 50 billion US. And at the time, everyone, 70% of the shareholders signed off on this. And they said, we're very happy to do this because, it's going to give us a more than 100% return on our investment, and, which is a sizable profit. And we're very happy to go along and do this. And, so more than 70% of the shareholders approved this pay package. So guess what? Elon ends up, effectively quadrupling the value of the company.
Yeah, more at one point more than that.
Yes,
eight times at one point.
Yes, and then he ends up getting this sizable payout, and the Delaware courts, because Tesla is incorporated in Delaware, suddenly turned around and because there is one shareholder who filed an application in a Delaware court to say that this was unfair compensation and that he was prejudiced. Now, said shareholder, in fact, benefited by the fact that his share value...
Yeah, his stock went up. With the value of the company.
Yeah, but by a few thousand% as a matter of interest. But this was clearly a put-up job where they wanted a single shareholder who was going to go to court. And the courts have basically struck down this pay package, as a result of which Musk has now started to move his companies out of Delaware into other parts of the country. So you're seeing this exodus from Democrat-controlled kleptocracies, which is essentially what this is, because New York is effectively stealing $500 million from Trump for something that it's a very systematic move that's aimed at bankrupting the guy.
Yes, absolutely.
Ahead of the election.
Very, very clearly.
Yes.
Very clearly. And I think also psychologically aimed at him because, he's an egotistical man and he's always traded on the fact that he's wealthy.
Some have actually called the guy a narcissist, and as said, well, I'm inclined to agree with that. But
yeah, all right. Well,
but
very successful narcissist.
But being a narcissist is not a crime. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, well, being a narcissist is not a crime, and it's also that sort of fine line between courage, is it courage and arrogance, right? So if or confidence and arrogance. If you're really good at something and you really know how to do it well, and you pull it off, and you go around telling everyone how good you are at this thing and that you pulled it off, is that confidence or is that arrogance? To me, that's confidence. Arrogance is when you claim to be able to...
But you see, I don't really care what you call it, because ultimately it's a question of, are you judging people by their actions, or are you judging people by the way in which they project themselves? And, frankly, I think that actions are a far more important determinant as far as the world is concerned.
Absolutely.
Because, but again, to go back to your Overton window, where... words are violence, but violence is not violence. So using that to correlate with the Trump example, you're not judging him in terms of what was his overall impact in terms of the U.S. economy. Well, first of all, he cleaned up the U.S. economy. Real wages grew for the first time in something like 20 years, which, particularly in terms of people who are employed by Walmart, as an example, it's the first real increases that they've had. By the same token, nearly all of those increases have been wiped out under Joe Biden. Nobody's talking about that. And it's been wiped out because of inflation. It's been wiped out by the dramatic increase in the cost of fuel. There's a whole range of things. But everyone says, oh, no, Trump is the guy who says, grab her by the et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. It's well, I mean, and not only the American side of things. It's interesting to me with regards to, I'm not an American, and I'm unlikely to be an American in the near future. No plans. So
you don't plan to walk across the border from?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I wanted to be in America, not be an American, but if I wanted to be in America, yeah, sure, I could just walk from the southern border
and
into the United States.
Vote.
You may very well get to vote. They just elected a non-citizen Chinese woman, Chinese citizen, to be on the elections sort of council in San Francisco. So, yeah, that's what's happening. But I look at it from a global perspective. During that period, the world had there was a lot of good stuff that went down. No, sorry, Kanthan's just dying from something. It's because he's older than me. The ribbing has started. During that time, there was a lot of good things that happened. I mean, people seem to forget we had an ISIS problem. We had terrorist attacks across Europe. You can go back to Paris and other places in Europe over that period of time before Trump. We had those issues. He de-escalated the wars in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, with an intended pullout that Biden then completely screwed up. And just generally, globally, we seem to have a lot more sort of peace. The Abraham Accords, which I think are arguably one of the greatest.
Well, it's the first real progress to peace in the Middle East.
Completely. I was going to say
ever since the 1960s.
The greatest achievement of his administration, and arguably one of the greatest achievements of any administration in the modern era. So we had all of that that went down. He also kind of managed to blunt Iran quite heavily because of pulling out of the JCPOA or stunting it essentially. And as a result of that, the world was a lot more stable a place. Of course, then the American economy grew, which means everyone's economy generally grew. There was just a little bit more prosperity globally. Now, that doesn't mean there were no problems, and that doesn't make him perfect. But it was a lot better than the last sort of 3 years we've had with someone who seems, he's not senile. He's not sentient. He's senile. And he seems intent on, or the people around him and controlling him or controlling his presidency seem absolutely intent on destabilizing what is the most powerful country in the world, which means the whole world becomes destabilized.
On the other hand, what if you take the view that they're in fact not destabilizing, but they're merely consolidating a power position, which is what they need in order to continue doing what they are doing right now?
Okay,
and it's clearly not going to come from the perspective of allowing a Trump presidency to happen, for example. So the reason why you need to have Biden as the candidate that goes into the next election is precisely because he doesn't run the country.
Yes.
And it's his handlers that in fact run the country and set policy, and he gets notes in terms of who he's supposed to meet, what standpoint he's supposed to take on particular events. The problem that he has is that there are some things that are completely out of his control. So, for example, so let's use the current conflict between Israel and Hamas as a very good example. There's a number of people around the world who are saying that Biden refuses to tell Netanyahu to declare a ceasefire. And my take on it is very different. My take on it is that Biden has told Netanyahu we want a ceasefire, and Netanyahu has extended a middle finger to Biden.
Yes, I think that, and the reporting from the Israeli press is essentially that.
Yes, but from the point of view of the Biden administration, they cannot be telling the world that they lack the ability to tell Israel what to do. And so they go on with all of these narratives that get crafted from the sidelines. So, for example, it's very clear to me that the U.S. Was very much in favor of South Africa's ICJ application against Israel.
You think so?
Yes, and the reason why I think that is because it allows them to find a way to curb the current Israeli government. And look, it'd be unfair to single out Netanyahu because you actually do have a unity government in place in Israel right now, and I think they are speaking with one voice.
Generally, yes.
Generally. Well, certainly from a military strategy point of view, it's very clear they are speaking with one voice currently. But to go back to the point of, if you have the Biden administration unable to publicly call out Netanyahu because the Democrats certainly do not want to upset the very strong pro-Israeli support that they have within their ranks, but at the same time, they are very clear that they want to continue courting the ever-growing anti-Israel support within their ranks. And, you see this within the likes of the Squad, as an example. It's very clear that this is a very strong and, to my mind, quite a disastrous faction of the Democrats. So how do you destabilize the situation in Israel without saying that you're destabilizing the situation in Israel?
So okay, let's say that is the case. I mean, there are certainly some Republican senators, congressmen who've come out in objection to that ICJ claim taken by South Africa. So obviously, it's not completely one-sided in terms of the American side of things, but certainly the American left would not have been upset with that ICJ case. I suppose the question to be asked on the back of whether the Americans are supportive of that claim would be, is it just, in your opinion, to make them look better in terms of their control over Israel, or is there a longer sort of strategy here? Because you talk about the Squad. That is the Democratic Socialists of America. AOC, for example, is a member.
Sure.
And I will take this opportunity in the first podcast episode to remind everyone that socialists are no different to Nazis, and that they killed just as many or more people, and we should look at them in the same way. Unfortunately, we don't. I do, but many people don't. What would you say? Is that more of a long-term play as well?
Well, the big play that's happening right now is that there's going to be an election at the end of this year.
Yeah.
And the optics right now in terms of all of these protests that are taking place throughout the U.S. means that there's immense pressure on Biden on an ongoing basis to actually stop the conflict that's currently happening. And at the point at which Biden is being seen to not be doing anything about it, that looks very bad for him from an electioneering point of view. And every day that the conflict proceeds in the Middle East makes Biden look worse. However, Biden is not in a position to come out and tell all of the people who are protesting that I'm going to call out Netanyahu on this, because he's not in a position to do that. So,
he's got a complicated he's got a complicated support base in this regard. In that, American Muslims generally vote for the Democratic Party, and there are several states where that constituency is important. Minnesota, as an example. However, there are also most of the Jews vote for the Democratic Party, and that is also a significant constituency in places like New York. And so, to try and please both sides, certainly if the whole goal is winning an election, that becomes quite difficult, because...
Which is exactly why the way in which you diffuse the situation is to get...
a third party.
The third party, the ICJ in this particular case. Okay.
And So you're bringing in... Your main argument is, yes, we've all heard that the Iranians probably funded the ANC's election campaign.
I don't believe that the Iranians funded the ANC election, because the logistics of the Iranians getting money into this country are, I think, far-fetched.
Okay.
Remember that it would have been relatively easy for any country to bring the application before the ICJ, and certainly all of the Arab countries could have taken a view on this. But now let me give you a different take on this matter again, which and this again is the question of nuance, which people don't drill down to. So we all know that Iran is anti-Israel and is completely dedicated
To its
very publicly
eradication.
to the eradication of Israel. All right?
Absolutely.
So,
They've said that.
let's park that. What's also very clear is that Iran does not support Hamas. Iran supports Hezbollah. They unashamedly support Hezbollah. They have been very clearly funding Hezbollah over the course of years. There's weapons that get across into Lebanon that clearly come from Iran.
From Iran, yeah.
But take the view as well that Hamas are fundamentally Sunni, and as Sunnis view the Iranians as apostate and are dedicated to their eradication. So the reason, so now,
Yeah.
so,
But isn't it
so-
a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Well, at one level, because remember, Iran was very clear, and say this much about the Iranians: they are very quick to take credit when things happen that actually
meet
suit
their
their
ends,
agenda.
yeah.
So October 7th happens, and Iran comes out and says, "We want to be very clear that we had nothing to do with this. We are against the Israeli regime, but." They were making it very clear that they were not directly involved in terms of supporting Hamas. Very clearly, again, in terms of the weaponry that Hamas has been deploying. So if you look in terms of their drones and so forth, it's not the type of weaponry that is being used by the Houthis. So again, let's be clear. Iran
The
is
Houthis
backing the
are-
Houthis.
yes.
Okay. For very
But
similar
I just want
reasons.
to pause you for a second, because do you remember a few years back, several years ago, there was a flotilla which wasn't allowed to get to Gaza.
I do
There was a
remember
lot
the
of
flotilla, yes.
issues about that, because it was there was a whole military operation around it. You can go read up on it. But the point is that allegedly had weapons from Iran, and the Israelis are pretty adamant that I'm not talking about now, but certainly previously, that there is weaponry in Gaza and that has been used by Hamas, which is Iranian bought, essentially. Several of the missiles, for example, that aren't sort of homemade, aren't homegrown, are claimed to come from Iran.
Look, I'm the type of person who goes out of my way to look for smoking guns
Yeah.
in terms of this. And so I look in, so we've seen the missile production facilities that Hamas has been building in those underground bunkers. You know, the evidence around that has been very clear.
I actually think at this point to call them underground bunkers is almost unfair. There's a tunnel network, and even to call them tunnels, you need to think of them as tunnels like you drive your car through the sides of mountains when you go to Cape Town, because these things are huge.
Yes.
And apparently the sort of square meterage of them is larger than the London Underground. So to give you some sort of context on just how much sort of tunnel infrastructure there is a city under the city, completely dedicated to sort of a military operation, but nevertheless a very, very well constructed and well operated infrastructure.
So, but to go back to the point that I'm trying to get to here in terms of how the power play is actually working in this part of the world. Now, firstly, so let's just tackle the most important thing in terms of who's supporting who. Okay, the Saudis don't want anything to do with Hamas.
Yeah.
Okay, certainly the UAE wants nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas's logistical support at a diplomatic level as well as funding is coming via Qatar.
Yeah.
It's very clear around that because that's where the Hamas leadership is currently based. You know, they're very safely ensconced in Qatar. The Egyptians want nothing to do with Hamas at all. In fact, the Egyptians want nothing to do with the Palestinians at all.
Absolutely.
And again, this goes back to 1967, because remember at that time, Gaza was actually part of Egypt.
Yeah.
In the same way that
The Sinai
that
Desert.
the West Bank was part of of Jordan.
Correct.
At the time. And remember, at the conclusion of the 1967 war, Israel was actually saying to Egypt, take Gaza and incorporate it into your territory along with the people that are there.
Well, it's interesting because Israel actually took a whole bunch of Egypt as territory, not just that part, but further south.
Yes.
And then as part of sort of ceasefire peace negotiations around that time to end that war, they sort of ceded back a whole bunch of territory which they had taken from Egypt. But Egypt then didn't take back all of it.
Yes, they did not want to take Gaza. And by the same token, Jordan did not want to take the West Bank. Now, and again, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Gaza happens to be a stronghold of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are committed to overthrowing the current government of Egypt. And that's the reason why Egypt
and got pretty close before the CIA's color revolution.
Yes, absolutely. And so Egypt is very clear. They do not want to open up their borders to refugees that are then going to be based in their country and committed to overthrowing their government. Similarly, the people of the West Bank, remember that they tried
to tried a coup against the Jordanian king.
Yes, they tried to take out the Jordanian king. And so the Jordanians are very clear that they want nothing to do with the people of the West Bank as well. But so you have the scenario where if you drill down to looking at the history of the area from 1967 onwards, the surrounding Arab states do not like the Palestinians. Let's be very clear about this. By every objective measure, they do not like the Palestinians. However,
this is the however I'm waiting for.
They are united in their antipathy towards Israel.
Yes. Some of them.
Yes. Now remember, and so going back to the Abraham Accords, very good starting point. The Abraham Accords effectively upended a lot of that stuff because for the first time, what Trump was able to achieve with the Abraham Accords was to decouple the fate of Palestinians from the question of relationships between the Arab states and Israel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Trump's viewpoint was basically, as long as you keep these two things tied together, you're never going to have resolution. Mm-hmm. So let's rip these things apart. And let's try and say, what can we do to actually first ensure that there's not a conflict that's ongoing between Israel and the surrounding countries? And then let's look at how we address the question of a solution in terms of Palestine.
Did you listen to, there was a great podcast with Jared Kushner and I think he was on Lex Friedman's podcast. Now, I would never recommend Lex Friedman's podcast.
I had Jared Kushner talking on the All In podcast, which is a great podcast, by the way.
Okay.
And, I highly recommend it.
So he did one with Lex Friedman, and fortunately Lex didn't say much the entire podcast, which is why it's bearable. And Kushner is a very smart guy, and was clearly running that part of the Trump administration in terms of the Abraham Accords. And he just describes exactly what you're saying.
Just perspective, by the way, I must put out there that Jared Kushner is Trump's son-in-law.
Yes.
He went to work for the administration. He did not draw a salary for the time that he was working with the administration.
Yeah.
Neither did his wife, Ivanka Trump, who's
Trump's daughter.
Trump's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, there was scathing commentary in the mainstream media around the fact that Kushner was going to be attempting to broker peace.
Kushner, a Democrat, I might add. He's not really a Republican.
Yes.
You must go back and look at his history, his family, his father, etc. He tells some of the story certainly on the Friedman podcast. But the point is, he's a very smart guy who describes exactly his thinking around the Middle East and what he went to do in the Middle East and how he got to the Abraham Accord. So I highly recommend it. But it's exactly what you're describing, which he said, okay, I understand there's this one issue. What are the other issues? And how can we work towards those issues, understanding that we may have to leave this one issue to the side for now, to everyone's benefit, though, and certainly to yours, because, if you're the UAE, restricting trade with Israel, which is arguably the strongest economy in the Middle East, then I think it is by definition the strongest, but restricting trade with them doesn't make sense, because you're just shooting yourself in the foot, because there's a group of people whose plight you agree with, but trade restriction doesn't change that, has never changed that, isn't going to change it. And in fact, if you open up to them, you may actually have a little bit more swing in future in terms of how they decide on policy and where they go with things. Because if you become a strong trading partner, then you have relationships with the government. You have positions to say things, to say, we'd really like it if you would behave in this way in future. So I mean, I think that background and the context is important. But I interrupted you in terms of Iran and where we are now.
Yes. So I think that if we look in terms of how this is going to play out, which is going to be kind of an interesting scenario, because remember that the ICJ deadline for Israel to report back is coming up soon. And there's been massive pressure on the part of many people, meanwhile, to try and get a ceasefire, or whatever you want to call it, a cessation of actual hostilities for a period of time. And if you take a look at this very objectively, if I was in Netanyahu's position as an overall military strategist, what I would be doing right now is, by intensifying military action as much as I possibly can, then declaring a ceasefire on the day before one pitches up at the ICJ, and going to the ICJ and saying, well, exactly as per your request, we are pointing out that hostilities have ceased, and so clearly we are not committing genocide.
Well, they don't really need to do that in the end, given what the ruling was. I mean, that is, I think, moot at this point. I think South Africa, it was of great pleasure to me as someone who supports Israel, doesn't think they're doing anything wrong in the regard of their response to the October 7th attacks.
Except this is not a question of right or wrong.
No, I get that, but I'm just talking from a personal opinion and an emotive perspective, not a factual perspective. This is my personal view: is that the case was ridiculous. And what I really loved about how that played out was, we were told South Africa's best minds, their best legal minds, Kanthan, the best we have, they're at the ICJ, and they're going to wipe the floor with the Israelis. And that court is a leftist court, let's be honest. That court is not a friend of Israel. And certainly a lot of the people there, you can go look at their backgrounds and figure it out for yourself. But I can assure you, these are not people who are largely on Israel's side. They certainly wouldn't be on a Donald Trump government side or even a Bush government side. These are generally left-wing folks. And that's how you end up on a human rights court. But the point is that they didn't wipe the floor with anyone. They made a bit of a fool of themselves, in fact. And that was even in the general ruling, not just the dissents, but in the general ruling, there was a lot of admonishment, in a way, of the South African argument. And that gave me a lot of personal joy. So Israel doesn't really need to now have that sort of ceasefire. What the ruling was, look, don't commit genocide. We're telling you you're not allowed to do that. But we're also not saying you're doing that. So we're just giving you a warning, don't do that. And you may continue, as long as you continue to be providing aid and allowing international aid through, which is occurring. And that's kind of that. And so Israel got off better, in my opinion, than they were before the case started.
So, again, from my perspective, because, disclaimer, I certainly have more Israeli friends than I have Palestinian friends.
Okay.
In fact, the last Palestinian person that I can think of that I called a friend was Edward Said, who passed away some years ago, and of course he left the Palestinian Authority because of rampant corruption on their part. But I don't have a personal stake in this at the same emotional level that you do.
Yeah.
So my viewpoint on this is, I look in terms of what are the various pieces in play right now, and then what is the logical outcome that's going to come as a direct result of this.
So what is the logical outcome?
And the logical outcome for me, comes down to the fact that when everyone was saying, don't go into Rafah, because of the fact that that's the place where everyone has taken refuge. And guess what? Israel goes in and pulls out a couple of hostages.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, let's be very clear in terms of the
good propaganda win for Israel.
Yes. But again, in terms of the ICJ ruling, remember Hamas was supposed to be releasing the hostages. But let's put that aside. What is going to happen is that Israel is going to continue until they have effectively eliminated Hamas as a military threat. And the reason why Israel is going to do this has got nothing to do with the ICJ. It's got nothing to do with what Biden may say. It's got nothing to do with whether or not there's international condemnation. It's got nothing to do with whether or not there are sanctions brought to bear. It's because it is an existential threat. And when you have an existential threat, your choices are either you bow to the threat, in which case you get wiped out, or you proceed down a path, no matter how much it is going to hurt you at other levels, because it is that's the nature of existential threats. And people who fail to understand how those things actually work are not thinking clearly enough. If you get emotional around
there's a lot of people who don't think clearly about existential threats. You talk about existential threats. You mentioned the word invasion, invaders, earlier in the podcast. America certainly has that problem, but Europe has that problem. The United Kingdom has that problem. South Africa has that problem. We all of these countries mentioned, and Europe's a continent, but essentially they're trying to be one kumbaya family, which will ultimately fail. But the issue is that nation states exist because there is some sort of unified culture. This is the whole argument for Cape secession, by the way. They claim they have a unified culture in the Cape, but that isn't the South African culture. But the point is nation states have a unified culture of some sort. And when you start bringing in a lot of people from the outside who have no intention of integrating into that unified culture at any level whatsoever, you create a lot of disruption.
It's the essence of chaos theory, effectively. So, just to kind of break this down, if you have a highly complex system, and by definition, societies are highly complex
possibly systems. The most complex system outside of the sort of universe.
But essentially, you can introduce minor changes into a complex system, and the system is very quickly able to absorb.
You can urinate into your swimming pool. You'll never notice it.
And you won't notice the difference. Very good example. So historically, what has happened, particularly in terms of democratic, open Western societies, when you introduce these levels of change and you kind of drip feed it. So, and the U.S. is a great example because you had Chinese migrants at one part of its history. You had Korean migrants at one part of its history.
Irish migrants
at one part of its
Italians.
history. Italians. Indians. More recently.
90s,
Yes. There was a very strong influx of North African migrants, Ethiopians in particular, that went into the northeast U.S. And they got absorbed. They assimilated. They settled communities within a greater American context, but they all bought into the notion.
Yes.
And when you have a society that carefully controls immigration, then the system as a whole is able to absorb it, and the system then adapts to accommodate what's coming in.
Yeah.
But when you have the situation that you have right now, which is instead of, as you say, pissing into the swimming pool, instead you connect your sewerage pipe straight into the swimming pool, and that's the situation that you have right now.
Yeah,
it causes a complete disruption.
You're going to get a lot of trouble for comparing this problem to sewage, but I look, I also want to point out that the system will also ultimately equilibrate with that new element that you've added. But the problem is it won't be the same system you had before. So the United States will not cease to exist because
I disagree that it will eventually reach equilibrium, because the alternative to reaching equilibrium is that it tears itself apart, which is not an equilibrium.
Yeah, so I mean, it would tear itself apart. This is an interesting notion. I had an argument with someone the other day about South Africa as an example, and they said, well, South Africa is going to end up as sort of 10 different countries. And I said, no, it's not. You want to believe it will, because that probably suits you and it makes us all feel a little bit better. We all think that, for example, let's say the Cape seceded and the KZN seceded and Gauteng seceded, and everyone becomes our own little principalities or countries within and of ourselves. And then we think, well, Gauteng's not that big and it's quite productive from an economic perspective. So, we can manage this ourselves. And it's a lot easier to manage Gauteng, which is a smaller geographic area with less people and less problems in some ways.
Except all of our water comes from Lesotho.
Oh, no, we'll get to the resources at another point. This is the part I laugh about the Western Cape. We'll have a whole episode, I think, on Western Cape secession and what you and I each think about that and the pros and the cons. The point is, though, is that it sounds like a great idea, but it doesn't really happen. It does over maybe hundreds of years. So, the world you see now on a world map is not what the world looked like 150 years ago. And certainly it looked very different 400 years ago. But that's also got a lot to do with exploration and conquerage and all that stuff. We've had the world is a very different place because we've made rules that are somewhat stupid, in my opinion. And some of them are very nice rules and they make us feel good and warm inside. But I'll give you an example. You're not at all allowed to conquer another country anymore because those were the agreements signed after World War II, which pretty much everybody signed. So the only way, for example, Putin gets part of Ukraine is if Ukraine comes to the table and agrees. But Putin is not allowed to say, the war has ended, I'm building a border fence.
But again, there is an out there, because remember that parts of countries are allowed to secede.
Yeah. So I hear you. There are ways to do it, but it has to be within...
So the entire breakup of Yugoslavia being the blueprint for how this effectively happens. Right?
Yes.
So use that as the business model for how you can effect conquest.
Okay, but it cannot happen with I wake up one morning as the leader of a country and I'm going to conquest other countries. There's got to be some level of acquiescence. It's got to happen within the sort of Western paradigm and within these
color
rules.
Revolutions.
So color revolutions is one way you do it on the sly, which makes it look like it's the people who want it. And obviously the other way you do it is with war, but then you have negotiated settlements and things like this. The other problem we have is war now. War is still terrible, but the problem is if you want to truly defeat an enemy, Geneva Convention makes that impossible. And what Geneva Convention allows to happen is it allows your enemy to work against you because they are not signed to the Geneva Convention. So Hamas, as an example, if Israel...
Well, Geneva Convention cannot work in the case of a guerrilla war.
Yeah.
Because you don't have uniform personnel.
So we have this problem because there's a disconnect, right? And there's discord. What we have is Hamas, who isn't a signatory to the Geneva Convention, went into Israel on the 7th of October, raped a whole bunch of women, burnt a whole bunch of children, families, shot people at point blank range, innocent citizens, threw grenades into bomb shelters and killed multiple people, simultaneously civilians. All of that, if Israel did that, then not only would they have an ICJ problem, they'd have multiple problems. If America did that, they'd have multiple problems. Yes, the punishment for when they do violate these things, like Abu Ghraib as an example, is probably not as harsh as it should be. Joe Biden drone struck a whole bunch of kids following the Afghanistan withdrawal and the bombing that took place at the airport there, which killed 13 Marines. He then got bad intel.
Trump took out Soleimani.
Trump took out Soleimani. I think there's a little bit of a difference between taking out Soleimani and taking out two kids.
No, it's still an attack of a state representative in a third-party country in defiance of international law.
Sure, but what I'm getting at is large scale. We have a world where we've tied our hands behind our back as the good guys, so to speak. And if you're a bad guy and you're willing to break those rules, then your hands aren't tied behind your back. And, immigration is one of these areas where we have the same problem, because we have these rules where you're not meant to come over someone's border if you're not meant to do that, if it's not a kind of open border. So if you're a Schengen state, for example, you're a member of one of the other Schengen states, you can just cross the border, no big problem. But if you're not meant to do that, if you're not from one of those other states, then you're not allowed to. The problem we have is that we've then made a whole bunch of rules on top of that, which turn around and say, well, you're not allowed to, but if you manage to achieve it, then we can't just throw you out. We can't put you in a police van, handcuff you as a criminal because you've violated the law of that country. We can't put you in a van, drive you back across the border and drop you off. It's not how it works, because we're civilized, of course, and we are from the West and we're better than that. And so we have to give you a whole bunch of processes that involve how we go about this. So we've got to first identify why you're here. Are you a refugee? Are you legitimate? Are you illegitimate? Are you claiming asylum? And different countries have different rulings, but essentially you've got the UN and a couple of other agencies who dictate what the rules should be about all of this. And the whole world has swallowed this hook, line, and sinker. So that, in the States, for example, you have a situation where there are 8 million so far, but probably 10 to 12 million by the end of the year. 10 to 12 million people who've come into that country under the Biden administration who have been told, you naughty, naughty boy, you should not be here. Here's a piece of paper to appear in court in 3 to 4 years' time. We'll see you then. And that's just irrational. But these are the rules we're sort of following as countries, and I suppose getting back to the original point about whether we'll split apart, and you talked about we'll all come apart, America will come apart, it won't equilibrate. When I talk about equilibration, so I don't see countries coming apart. You look at Africa. I've traveled relatively extensively across Africa, and I find this always interesting about South Africans, because South Africans seem to think that they're the worst thing that's ever happened to the world. The things that are happening to us, the bad things, the decline of the country, the economy, all these things. Wow, no one else has ever seen anything like this. Just fly 4 hours north of our border, guys. Like, pick a country. Pick another country north of our border. There's 51 of them, I think. Or now 52, I think, with South Sudan. But the point is there's more than 50 states you can pick. Go to any of them. They're all worse than us.
Although, let me say again, qualifying this. Okay,
yes.
You have to just pick 3 countries in our immediate vicinity.
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that right now, Botswana's trajectory is better than ours.
Yes, it's a better
Zimbabwe's trajectory is better than ours.
You're going to have to explain that, yeah.
And Zambia's trajectory is currently better than
ours. And Rwanda, I would add in there as well.
And, Rwanda's an interesting. I agree with you. Yes, and Rwanda certainly in terms of bettering the lives of people on the ground on an ongoing basis and having a safer society and all of those boxes, to a large extent, it's actually ticking those boxes. Kenya.
Interesting.
Certainly in terms of human development, by almost any level, they're streets ahead of us. They are leapfrogging us in terms of the tech space, particularly in terms of telecommunications, but also in terms of medtech, because there's significant investments that are going on right now in Kenya in terms of setting up
that space.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just. I suppose the point I'm getting at is that there's a lot of examples of collapsed African countries or so-called collapsed states, failed states, and the debate on whether you're a failed state or not, what's the definition of that, etc. You can go back and forth, but the point is there's a lot of those examples in Africa, and they don't tear themselves apart. They just become sort of permanent chaos factories to some extent. And they equilibrate to the point where, if you go to a country like Uganda, it's just it's rundown buildings, it's rundown cars, it's poorly maintained public infrastructure, that kind of thing. But life sort of carries on, you know. And at one point, it didn't look exactly, certain parts certainly of it didn't look as bad as that. Ghana is another fair example. It's had sort of ups and downs over the last few decades. You know, South Africa's got a potentially a long way to go down, in fact, in terms of where it could get to, and the States is the same kind of situation. So what I'm saying is, you maybe absorb 10 million immigrants who don't believe in the American way of life. They don't view themselves as Americans, and maybe never will. Those people then reproduce 2 to 3 times, and now you have 30 million people 30 years down the line who have that
American
view.
Citizens, because
yes, those people are American citizens, but they don't buy into anything. They don't buy into George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, etc. You know, the American dream, so to speak. And so America, in my opinion, may still exist. Now, America might not exist because it's a union, so it may split into states.
Well, not necessarily split. And, you know, let's just go back to one of the Overton window issues you brought up earlier, which is the question of abortion. And so, you know, we had that significant ruling around the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which is effectively a Supreme Court action that legalized abortion in the United States for a number of years. Now, so again, in terms of perspective, as an individual, I'm very much pro-choice, and I always have been. And there's philosophical arguments around that, which we won't go into. But at the same time, I said Roe versus Wade was a terrible thing. And the reason why it was a terrible thing is because it was legislation that came from the benches and not as a direct result of the will of the people. So, you know, again, by comparison, Italy, overwhelmingly Catholic country, legalized divorce by referendum, legalized abortion by referendum. That's the democratic way to be doing things. The situation that you had in the United States was that this was imposed by the courts.
Yes.
And as a result, was always going to be divisive. And the courts have now pulled back, and they've said, actually, it is for the states themselves to determine the laws in terms of their particular borders.
Yes.
And if that view then gets applied, for example, to the question of the migration problem, if it eventually gets to the Supreme Court, and in my view, the current Supreme Court is likely to say it is up to the individual states to decide how they are going to act in terms of...
It's interesting you say that. I think I disagree with how the court would rule, not necessarily on what the correct ruling is. But and the reason I say that is because a few weeks ago they ruled on Texas putting up their own sort of border fencing. Essentially, they were putting up barbed wire and other structures to try and stop people crossing the Rio Grande. And that went all the way. The Biden administration wanted to take down the border fencing that had been put up, the barbed wire,
But let's be very clear about the outcome of that particular case. The court
fair enough.
The court ruled that the Biden administration had the right to take down the fences.
Yes.
They didn't say that Texas did not have the right to put up the fences.
Yes. Okay.
But because the federal government has control of national borders, they do have the right to be able to control egress across the borders.
Yes. So that's why I say I disagree with the way they may rule, because the court seems to view the borders as a federal, in other words, the federal government, and not the federated states, the federal government's issue. In other words, so the sea and the land borders are controlled by the executive.
Yes.
And so I think they may rule on the side of the executive. The real thing is the long term, as we're talking about, is I'm just saying that you could see a state like California, for example, just not resemble what California used to be, but still be called California, right? And so we have this already. I mean, California is already that. A friend of mine posted on Facebook the other day that he used to He used to think that's where he'd like to go live, California, because it was just, there's, it's a beautiful place. The weather's pretty good for North America. It's mild all the time.
Last time I was in San Francisco was 2011. I went there for Steve Jobs' final appearance at the Apple Developer Conference.
What a great story.
And I must tell you, the place is a shithole. Okay, it was a shithole back then in 2011. I wrote comparisons in terms of San Francisco versus Cape Town, as an example, and already the seeds of decay
were starting,
were quite evident, and this has happened in all of these.
Yes, so the point that was being made was, once upon a time it seemed like paradise, and now it isn't, but it's still California, and there are at least several millions of people. It's still the most populous state in the United States, who seem willing to accept the decay. South Africa is a good example of this as well. There are many people in this country who lived through a better time. And I'm not talking about apartheid, by the way. I'm talking about the 90s.
If you have access to these gated communities where you're able to comfortably maintain your lifestyle and you don't have a problem with migrants coming into your space because you do have access control, effective border controls, which is the same that we have in this country in all of these gated communities, then, hey, yes, it is.
That's all fine and well until paradise. You get a gun pointed at your driver's window on the highway in the morning.
Yes.
and get asked to hand over your phone.
Yes, but now that you do work from home, or, if you have a private helicopter, then, these are things that...
I want to know your friends, Kanthan.
That don't really affect
flying
you.
to work.
Yeah. Look, I think that we've covered a lot of ground in this space, and we probably need to be wrapping up at this time.
We've got a few more minutes. I think that we'll keep this podcast sort of in the hour range, hour to probably hour and a half as a max. But I think this is kind of the way we want to run things in terms of this conversation, a flowing conversation. With topics, if it makes sense, we'll bring guests on as well over time. But I think you and I have plenty to discuss. So it's a good conversation. I just wanted to perhaps talk about South Africa quickly, because we haven't discussed too much. We've discussed a lot of global stuff, some US stuff, some of the Israeli issues. There's a lot here in terms of what's happening in the country at the moment.
Well, in fact, if we want to drill down right now, the most significant thing that's happening in our country is MK.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Okay. MK is where it's at.
And MK pretty much eclipses everything else.
Let me set the scene. Let me set the scene for a second before you go into that, because it was about a month ago. When did they announce? About a month ago. So the day before they announced, the political landscape was as follows. There's an election in the next 4 months. The ANC looks to be weakened, perhaps below 50%. Best case scenario around the 40% mark. Worst case scenario about the 49% mark. The EFF may be stronger, 10 to 15, but they may also be sub 8. Which means that there is a possibility that you end up with a coalition government with the DA anywhere around 25-30% at the head of that, along with a whole bunch of other coalition parties.
So let me tell you why I disagreed with that viewpoint pre-MK.
Okay.
The fact that the ANC support has dropped below 40% doesn't mean that those people who previously voted for the ANC are going to vote for someone else. In my view, they're more likely to just simply stay away from the polls.
Sure.
And so what that means is that the overall numbers of people who go to vote, in fact, come down. And so it doesn't mean that the people who didn't vote for the ANC are going to then...
Well, it depends how many stay home. Because if enough stay home, then it's... So if...
But there are two things that need to happen. You need enough people to stay home, and everyone who voted for the existing opposition parties... need to go out. If that is the case...
then you get a big win for the opposition.
Then you get a big win. It's not my view that that's the case. I think that there is rampant disillusionment across the board, across all of the political parties. And so there are two exceptions that now suddenly come up. Okay, Gayton is the one wild card.
Yeah.
But MK is the overwhelming.
Okay, so before MK, but you would agree that that was sort of the landscape before
That
MK.
was the landscape.
And look, my personal view on that was that wasn't going to happen. My view is that the ANC will achieve power,
50%
power
of the
again.
seats in parliament.
Yeah, by hook or by crook. Whether it's because people vote for the other party that's named similar to the ANC has a similar logo. I've considered registering a party just to get a seat in parliament. Like, you register a party called AMC, and you have a wagon wheel and like some similar colors. And the IEC will probably throw it back to you a couple of times, but you can get it close enough that some gogo who doesn't have glasses at the polls will get it wrong.
African Mossad Congress.
The African Mossad Congress. Let's go for that. And you would probably get 30,000 votes, which is roughly the threshold required. My view is that the ANC is going to retain power. I've held this view since 2010. I said that I thought the soonest the ANC would lose power was 2029. And that was based on my calculation of the trend, the downward trend in terms of their popularity at the time. However, the reality is that was the landscape before MK. And then MK came to the ground, which is basically Jacob Zuma. And now everything is different. So go for it.
My view is that MK is going to be the first real disruptor in terms of the ANC support base in its entire history. We had a couple of shifts over the years. So
Cope?
Well, let's just look at the historical context. Okay. So the first significant breakaway from the ANC was the PAC. And the PAC was a thing for a few decades, but eventually ended up getting wiped out. The IFP was a breakaway from the ANC. Let's be very clear about this, because remember that Gacha Buthelezi was from the ANC youth wing, and he had in fact been deployed by the ANC to set up Inkatha as a way of actually consolidating power, but then he turned around and took control of it.
Sounds like the EFF.
Then the EFF, again, is another breakaway. But then COPE prior to that.
Yes.
Again. Remember that COPE at the time garnered something like 20%.
Yeah, big. Their first election was huge.
Was massive. And what happened? Well, you had Shiloh and Lakota, who both got into a dick swinging contest, and they basically shredded that entire movement apart.
Correct.
So, and then you had the EFF again. You have Malema, who was head of the ANC Youth League, expelled from the ANC.
And then he started the ANC Youth League again.
And then he started the ANC Youth League as a separate political.
Which is why they still have their voting bloc is pretty much youngsters.
Yes. And now suddenly you have, but for the first time, you have a person of massive significance in terms of the ANC support base. Remember that at the time of Jacob Zuma taking over leadership of the ANC, he grew the ANC support base just in KZN alone by a couple of million voters. Just simply on the and correspondingly at the point at which he was no longer there, that support base has been lost, because you saw that drastic shift, decline in terms of voters in KwaZulu-Natal. Right now, the polling numbers are showing something like 10% for MK nationally. I think it's going to be bigger.
Yeah, that's early polls.
I think it's going to be bigger than that. And there's a fascinating anecdote that I heard.
So you don't think it's going to be just KZN?
I don't think it's going to be just KZN. I think it's going to be significantly larger than that. We've already seen the impact in the Eastern Cape. Okay, yeah. So, but here's a fascinating anecdote, and I think it's a good thought to leave our viewers with. That a very close friend of mine in Durban was asking his helper what he had to think, what she had to think around MK's ascendance to power and whether there was likely to be massive support. And she said, "Oh yes, everyone loves Jacob Zuma, and I promise you they're going to go out and support Jacob Zuma to the fullest." And he said, "That's interesting. Why?" And she says, because of July 2021.
Because they arrested him.
No, not because they arrested him.
Okay.
Because of July 2021. And this is the fascinating thing, all right? And I'm still been trying to get my head around it. She said, because July 2021, for the first time, we suddenly had things as a result of the looting that they have never had before. So they got fridges, they got TVs, they've got, all of the things that were stolen.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, was a wave of prosperity for people who never had those things before. And they are attributing that to Jacob Zuma. It's a fascinating thing.
Wow. Okay. Well, so that's some food for thought that you have not read in any kind of corporate or mainstream media. That's what we're going to be trying to do every single week, every second week.
Every second week, yes.
On this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it. At the moment, I don't have anything to plug. Please go do subscribe to the...
I want to plug my book again.
I'll let you plug your book in a second, you fiend. Okay, go for it. There you go. There it is on the camera.
How to Fix South Africa, an owner's manual.
Yeah.
You can go to howtofixsa.co.za.
Yeah.
To find out where to buy the book. But
it's a short book, guys. I mean, you really, it's a quick read.
Yeah, it's a quick read. It's 250 Rand at bookstores. So you can get it from Love Books in Johannesburg. You can get it from Clark's in Cape Town.
Yeah.
And you can get it from Ike's in Durban.
Okay. Exclusive?
Exclusive, I'm still trying to wade through the bureaucracy to get it onto the
really?
shelves. It's yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, please do go buy.
If you have
Kanthan's
people
book.
that you know in exclusives, just basically tell them they need to be stocking this thing.
Yeah. Well, if you could just go next time you're at Exclusive Books, just go ask them if they have that book, and when they say they don't, please ask them why, and if they could please stock it. And then I'm sure it will come into stock. As for plugging on my side, just the Overton Press. It's on Substack, overtonpress.substack.com. For now, if you just subscribe there'll be announcements about the podcast, as well as some other publications. You can go see what we published last year. Some really good articles, some thought-provoking stuff, including something on NHR from yours truly. And yeah, we hope you've enjoyed this. And we look forward to doing this for some time going ahead. And thank you very much for listening or watching. Please do pass this on to your friends and family if you found it useful and insightful. Thanks very much. We'll see you next time. Cheers.